The Russians just took the city of Kherson, which is on the lower part of the Dnieper River, right where it begins to flow into the Black Sea. So it's on the Black Sea. It's quite obvious why Russia would want this port city, because Russia wants to control the entire Ukrainian coast on that maritime territory, thus giving it more access into the Black Sea. The Russians also they want to take Ukraine because this is about empire building. And if Russia wants to revive its empire, it's going to need more access into the Black Sea, not just through the Sea of Azov. The Turks just blocked the Russian Navy from having access from the straits into the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that this is really a sign that eventually Turkey and Russia are going to have a war. It's not far-fetched to say that because they've had numerous wars over the centuries and Russia has won all of them. So it's really not that adventuresome to make such a prediction. Russia wants to have access into the Mediterranean. It really can't do that if Turkey controls the straits. So what's Russia to do? Eventually, there's going to be a war between Russia and Turkey because Russia wants that access through the straits into the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. It's really that obvious. Somebody came up to me today and asked me, what's going on in Putin's mind? I really don't understand why Putin's doing this. Why? And I just told them it's very simple. It's empire building. This is what we're seeing. It's empire building. Russia wants to revive its empire, just like Turkey wants to revive its empire. That's why Turkey is in Syria, Iraq, North Africa, the South Caucasus, because Turkey wants to revive its empire. It really is that simple. It's like when people were talking about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and how Russia wanted that pipeline because it wanted to bypass Ukraine. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline would allow, it would enable Russia to export natural gas directly to Europe without having to go through Ukraine and spend billions of dollars in transit fees into the Ukrainian economy. So every time Russia exports natural gas into Europe, it has to go through Ukraine, and so it has to pay Ukraine transit fees. Russia no longer wants to do this. This is why Russia wanted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, so that it could bypass Ukraine. The Ukrainians were terrified by this because they knew that if Russia could bypass Ukraine, then Ukraine no longer has that leverage. It can no longer demand for concessions. It can't say, hey, you're exporting your natural gas through my territory, so you're supposed to respect me. And I remember people talking about this, saying that this could lead to instability in the region, or this could it could cut Ukraine off from having any sort of geopolitical leverage. And we use these terms like instability or imbalance or destabilization and all these things, but we don't really get into what these look like or how these words look like. It's very simple. They mean war. That's what that means. It's like years ago, I remember reading about tensions between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands. And people were saying, tensions between China and Japan could lead to instability and blah, blah, blah. Well, and I always wondered, well, what does that look like? What does instability look like? And it's very simple. It means war. That's what that means. And so it's very interesting that Russia decided to have a war with Ukraine not too long after the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's almost like Russia said, oh, well, we have the pipeline, so we really don't need to respect Ukraine. So let's invade it. And I understand the Russians don't see this as an invasion. The Russians see this as taking what belongs to them, because Ukraine was a part of Russia at one point. The Russian Empire began in Ukraine. Christianity in Russia began in Kiev. And so the Russians simply see this as taking what belongs to them. So at the end of the day, it's the revival of empire. That's what this is. And we like to use these geopolitical terms like instability, imbalance, destabilization, destabilize. But the reality is that there are tensions between countries that eventually implode and they explode into full-out war. It really is that simple. And if you look at all of these events that have been taking place since the last decade, like, for example, the destabilization of the Middle East, or all the violence in the Middle East, ISIS, Turkey entering Syria, Iraq, North Africa, Russia entering the Middle East, and even in the decade before that, with the American invasion of Iraq. If you look at all of these major events, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, all of these events are simply increments leading towards a future global conflict. So we see Nazis rising up in Ukraine. We see Nazis setting up checkpoints and controlling the roads in Mariupol, in Crimea, not allowing civilians to leave Mariupol. In fact, there was a Greek guy, a Greek civilian living in Mariupol who recently did an interview stating that he can't leave the city because somebody in the interview asked him, hey, why don't you just leave Mariupol? And he said, how can I leave Mariupol when if I try to leave, I could be shot by fascists? So there are fascists in Ukraine rising up in power. The Ukrainian government gave free weapons to civilians so that they can fight against the Russians, and people were praising this, and I think there were some conservatives online saying something like, oh, this is proof that the Second Amendment is so important because, look, they had to give guns to their citizens. But who else got those guns? Criminals, neo-Nazi paramilitaries, ultra-nationalists, fanatics, murderers. And so the Ukrainian government is also setting itself up for chaos. And the founder of Azov, the Azov battalion, is the most prominent of the neo-Nazi paramilitaries in Ukraine. The founder of Azov, Andrei Belitsky, he stated, because he was at one point in time he was a member of the Ukrainian parliament from 2014 to, I want to say, 2019. He actually made a speech in Parliament years ago stating that he would dissolve Parliament and that he will not stop in his pursuit for total power. So the Nazis also want to control the Ukraine. So it's like, well, who do I want controlling Ukraine? Russia or Nazis? I'm going to go with Russia. And I also read that there are hundreds of Croatian neo-Nazis that have been traveling from Croatia to Ukraine to join in the neo-Nazi jihad against the Russians. So really, it's like the rhyming of history. Second World War, we had Ukrainian Nazis. They collaborated with the Germans. And today we have Nazis in the Ukraine wanting the same exact thing as their past relatives wanted. And it's very interesting. I saw a video of some Azov soldiers. They were training, and I saw a picture. I saw a clip showing an Azov battalion soldier with a German uniform. Why are neo-Nazi fighters in Ukraine wearing German uniforms? I think it's very obvious. A lot of these Nazi fighters were trained by the West. A lot of these Nazi fighters, I know I sound like some RT conspiracy theorist, but it's true. A lot of these Nazi fighters got their training from military schools from Canada, Great Britain, and the United States. And the West has been supporting Ukraine's military. And who is in Ukraine's military? There are a lot of Nazis in Ukraine's military. And people, I don't think people really realize how prominent these Nazis are, because before, when Russia first took Crimea, the Ukrainian military was very undertrained and underpaid. they weren't really that good. They weren't that efficient in the battlefield. The Azov battalion came in, and they became the backbone for the Ukrainian military. That's why they are a part of the National Guard. So people like to look to the past and they disconnect from the past. Oh, that was World War II. Who cares about that? But truly, I think what we have done as a modern world is we have created these facades to cover up the dark realities of society that still linger, dark realities that we simply confine to the past, but they're still here. You still have Ukrainian Nazis. You still have Croatian Nazis. You still have this aspiration for empire. The Russians want to revive their empire. They want to take much flesh. The Turks want to do the same thing. The Japanese want to do the same thing. And so what we're seeing really is the revival of ultra-nationalism. Russian nationalism, yes. At the same time, Ukrainian ultra-nationalism, which is extremely vicious. Probably more dangerous than Russian nationalism. Croatian nationalism. Turkish neo-Ottomanism. And so all of these events are simply increments leading to a global conflict. Russia versus Turkey, I think, is in the horizon. And also, the Germans, they have, overnight, they have shifted, they have done a real shift. I mean, they've been talking about this for years. They've been talking about increasing their military spending and boosting up their military capabilities and capacity and innovation. But I think since Russia entered Ukraine, they've really done a shift in real policy towards boosting up their military power. And what the Americans are doing is saying, okay, we really don't want boots on the ground. Europe, you have to boost up your own militaries. And so the Germans are reviving their military strength. So we're seeing the revival of Germany. We're seeing Ukrainian fascism, Turkish neo-Ottomanism. We're seeing Russia wanting to revive its empire and actually working on doing that and taking territory. We are seeing the facade that we have been using for decades to disconnect ourselves from the past dwindling away. That's what we're seeing. And so the past is becoming the present. So it's very fascinating what's happening. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.